Everyone. Good morning. Hope you're well. Hope you're healthy. Thanks for joining us today. We're going to talk about 8.3, which is the Russian Revolution and its effects. My name is Todd Beach. I'm a teacher. I teach AP European History at Eastview High School in Apple Valley, Minnesota. That is a suburb of Minneapolis and St. Paul. And this is Katie.
Hi, good morning. I'm Katie Lancey. I teach AP Euro at Coral Gables Senior High School in Miami, Florida. Welcome. Still spring break for me, last day of spring break. So I think I'll have a lot more of my students here next week. And it's the weekend, if there's such a thing anymore, really.
Exactly.
So today you're going to get to the lesson overview. But before we do that, I want to again address why we are continuing through units 8 and 9. This is content that is not going to be covered on the exam. I know it's only going to be units 1 through 7, but we are waiting to see what the exam is going to look like. And when we find that out next Friday, and we'll be talking about that, we will be moving quickly after that to review. We're going to get through the rest of the course so that we have some fidelity to the content and what colleges are expecting you to know when you move on to the sequence course. All right, Todd.
Okay. Our learning objectives today, we're going to talk about the causes and the effects of the Russian Revolution. So this lesson is going to include a discussion of the events that facilitated change of government in Russia. And when we talk about revolution with a capital R, we are talking about large change in government. So we'll unpack that today. There are going to be a couple points where we're going to pause and make sure that we're developing these historical thinking skills. The two that we're going to be working on today are skill 2, sourcing and situation, and skill 3, claims and evidence and sources. And so when we do get to those two skill development areas, if you have pencil paper out, that'll be a great place for you to jot down some ideas and some thinking for that skill development. And then the overriding reasoning skill that we're working on today or development is causation, cause effects of Russian Revolution. Okay, so for our warm-up, we left you yesterday, just yesterday, with this practice. So this was from the 2018 exam. And so it is from the cartoon is December 1921, a cartoon from a British magazine showing British Prime Minister Lloyd George and French Prime Minister Aristide Briand and a figure representing Germany kneeling in the water. And there's a caption on the cartoon, a transparent Dodge. Germany saying, "Help, help, I drown, throw me the life belt." And then Lloyd George and Briand saying, "Try standing up on your feet." Aristide Briand and Lloyd George taunt the drowning Germany is what we have captioned under the cartoon. So your task was, the A task is to describe one cause of the international situation depicted in the cartoon. The B task is and explain one effect of the international situation depicted in the cartoon. And the C task is to explain the cartoonist's perspective on the international situation depicted in the cartoon. And we gave you this email address to turn in your responses, and we received well over 100 responses from students. That was really cool to see your thinking. And so we selected a few of those, and I'm going to go through those now. For the A task, again, it's to describe one cause of the international situation. So describe a cause. This was a response from Ishan. One cause of the international situation depicted in the cartoon is, I'm going to stop there because, again, what we want you to do is use the stem of the prompt to begin your response to the prompt. So Ishan does that. One cause of the international situation depicted in the cartoon is the reparations that Germany had to pay to the Allied countries in response to the damages and losses that they suffered from World War I. No actual fighting took place on German soil, but other countries suffered extensive damage, like bombing of their cities. As a result of the Treaty of Versailles, Germany was ordered to pay reparations to the countries, specifically Britain and France, as depicted in the cartoon. So we have a description of a cause that's led to that international situation. It's really well done, Ishan. This response is from Catherine. And here it begins, one cause of the international situation depicted in the cartoon is. So again, really like that you've used the stem of the prompt to respond to the prompt. So one cause of the international situation depicted in the cartoon is the contents of the Treaty of Versailles. This treaty ended World War I and was signed on by many European powers. In this treaty, there was a section titled the War Guilt Clause that dealt with providing reparations for the war. In this clause, Germany was blamed for the war and was demanded to pay a large amount of reparations that was impossible for any country to pay, let alone a country that had just been defeated in war. These reparations are the cause of this cartoon, as the Germans are seen drowning in debt, with their only lifesaver being loans from Britain or France, who are watching them drown and unwilling to help. So that response from Catherine, that's a really nice response to prompt A. The next one is a prompt B. The task is an explain task. Explain an effect of the international situation depicted in the cartoon. So here's our first one that it would earn the point. So one effect of the international situation depicted in the cartoon was, and again, I'm going to keep saying this, but great job of using the stem of the prompt to respond to the prompt. Depicted in the cartoon was that France and England enforced strict punishments on Germany with the Treaty of Versailles, the peace agreement of World War I. Not only did it enforce harsh reparations, $5 billion, but it also limited its chances of regaining strength as a militaristic force, with its army and navy sizes decreased, as well as their power as a nation being reduced with the loss of some of their outside territories. That's responses from Ayantu. So has Ayantu given us an effect, and has it been explained? That is the how, why, or because. And yes, Ayantu has done a really good job. This response is from Eliza, handwritten response. A lot of you did handwritten responses, which is cool. One effect of the international situation depicting the cartoon is, again, using the stem of the prompt to respond to the prompt, political instability and the rise of the Nazi Party. Because the Weimar Republic was weakened by the treaty and associated with the loss of World War I, political chaos allowed for the Nazi Party to gain support from German citizens who crave financial and political stability. With the rise of the Nazis, specifically the rise of Adolf Hitler, the Weimar Republic finally collapsed. Really great response. You can see the explanation of the effect because we've got the word because in there. Really prompted Eliza to really explain it really thoroughly. So great job. That one's going to earn the point. And then the C prompt. Explain the cartoonist's perspective on the international situation depicted in the cartoon. And we have a couple of really good ones here. And before I get to the responses, we did read every response, even though there were well over 100. And where I saw errors, if there were errors, it was primarily on the C prompt, because what a lot of you were doing is you were telling me more about what was happening in the international situation, but this prompt is asking for the cartoonist's perspective. So make sure that we're reading the prompt carefully. What is the task that we're being asked to do? So here is from Ashwatha. The cartoonist's perspective on the international situation is one that believes that Britain succeeded in the war effort and significantly weakened Germany. As this was a cartoon in the British magazine, the cartoonist might show Germany's powerlessness as a way to generate nationalism within Britain. By showing that Britain's war efforts were crucial, the cartoonist obviously believes that Germany should be held responsible for the war. That is such a nice response because we're really focused on the cartoonist perspective in the international situation. So well done, Ashwatha. And then one more. This one is from Patrick. The cartoon depicts a figure representing Germany who is appearing to drown in water, but is actually only kneeling in a shallow pond. Because this cartoon was drawn for a British newspaper by a British cartoonist, the artist is trying to portray Germany as liars who are faking financial troubles in order to receive help paying off their war debt. Furthermore, the transparent water and the skeptical expressions of Aristide Brand and Lloyd George ridicule Germany by suggesting that their attempt to fake financial troubles is a very obvious one. The artist chose to portray Germany in this way because nationalistic feelings and the destruction during World War I caused the Allies to distrust Germany. So again, really nice response, Patrick. We have the cartoonist perspective explained really well So I really enjoyed reading through your responses. We were excited that so many of you responded. Really excited that I saw so many. You're obviously taking notes and you're handwriting out your responses and taking pictures. And we're going to leave you with another homework task at the end again today. But please trust that we read everything and really appreciate that you guys are working really hard at this. Okay.
All right. Yeah, I was really so impressed at all of the responses and just the intrinsic motivation you guys have to practice these skills. And I do promise again that when we have more direction as to where the test is going to go, we will be focusing the practice in the at the end of the lesson on those. So first, I want to take a minute and discuss some of those geo-sprite lenses that we talked about before as they pertain to the outbreak of the Russian Revolution. Russian society geographically is decisively conditioned by its position between Europe and Asia. And socially, the peasants have been emancipated, but they're still having to pay redemption payments to the state. The rapid industrialization has led to overcrowding. And in the cities, the labor force has been made up mainly of seasonal peasant workers, so they don't have really a tie to the city. Politically, so much is going on besides World War I. First of all, we have there on the right a picture of the Tsar, Nicholas II. We're still in a absolutist regime at a time when absolutism is really failing around the rest of Europe, right? So we are going to talk in a minute about how he will sort of grant some representation in the form of the Duma. But the Duma, when it disagrees with him, he ends up dissolving it. And we'll talk about the decade preceding the start of the Russian Revolution here in a second. World War I cannot be ignored. It leads to horrifying military casualties. It also, the troops really lack adequate supplies. They're led by incompetent officers. And we're going to see that this is really going to undermine the ability to try to, to try to increase the nationalism of the people and have them support the Tsar. And Russia is over its head. It simply cannot compete with the more industrialized Germany. Russia is going to have severe casualties, more casualties than any previous war. And economically, Russia is still behind. It's starting industrialization. It's still mostly agricultural. 80% of its people are still farming. And so we're seeing that most of this farming is done not on modern equipment. And we're going to have widespread food shortages and inflation prior to the start of the Russian Revolution. So this might sound very much like things that are also happening in France in 1789 before the French Revolution. All right, so contextually, the decade prior is just filled with controversy. The loss of Russia in the Russo-Japanese War really stirs up a lot of discontent about the government. And we have the very infamous Bloody Sunday moment. And Bloody Sunday is going to be when riots break out and the Tsar fires on the crowd or orders the crowd to be fired on. And that will cause strikes and uprisings to sweep throughout the country. And it's in response to that that Nicholas II agrees to create the Duma. He said he promises reform. He's going to have this popularly elected government. And yet what we're going to see in the next, decade or so is that he's not going to change the repressive ways. There's a speech, and please forgive me if I sort of butcher the quote, but the year after Bloody Sunday, after he's agreed to create the Duma, there's a quote to the Duma where he basically affirms that it's going to be an autocracy like his deceased father. And he kind of militantly says that this is not going to be a representational government. And that's really going to allow these radical groups that are wanting change to gain strength.
Okay, great. Thank you, Katie. We're going to pause here now. If you have something to write with and write on, this is a chance to do some of this sourcing. So skill number 2 is sourcing and situation. And I'm sure that your teachers work with you on sourcing the HAP, or sometimes CAP, sometimes teachers call it. That is, we're looking at the historical situation, the audience, the purpose, the point of view. So this is an excerpt of minutes from the Tsar's Council of Ministers. It was taken on August 24th, 1915. So let's think about that a second. 1914 in August is when Russia mobilized for war. So it's been almost a year that they have been mobilized and have been at war. And these are minutes of the Tsar's Council of Ministers. I'm going to do my best with these Russian names. I have a Russian speaker in one of my classes, and she cringes sometimes with my Russian pronunciation, but I'll do my best. And so it's a dialogue of these minutes that's going on. Shcherbetov, the Council of Ministers knows that there were disturbances in Moscow, which ended in bloodshed. There were even more serious disorders at Ivanovo, Voznesensk, when it was necessary to fire on the crowd, with the result that 16 were killed and 30 wounded. There was a critical moment when it was uncertain what the garrison would do. Shakovskoy, I have information that the workmen are quite agitated. Any kind of spark may start a fire. Gormikin, I should like to ask the Minister of the Interior what measures he is taking to put an end to the lawlessness going on everywhere. His principal function is to protect the state from disorder and danger. And this is Shcherbetov. So I'm going to pause for a second here. This is kind of a complex text because of how these Russian ministers speak, sometimes in third person. So Shcherbetov is the Minister of Interior, okay? So he's going to speak somewhat in third person here. So here it is, Shcherbetov. The Minister of Interior is taking all the measures which is his duty and in present circumstances permit. How can you expect me to fight the growing revolutionary movement when I am refused the troops on the ground, that they are unreliable, that one cannot be certain that they will fire on the mob? You cannot quiet the whole of Russia by the police alone. The population is growing daily more excited by the speeches in the Duma, by newspaper stories, by continuous defeats and rumors of disorders in the rear. So we have this excerpt from the Minister of the Tsar's Council, like a year into this. And so if you were to source this, and sourcing it kind of on its own here is weird, isn't it? But let's think that we know that there's a revolution coming, right? We know the end of that story. In 1917, there's a Russian Revolution. In 1914, we've got Russia involved in this war. This is 1915, and you can see the ministers concerned about what's going on in the government and in these cities. So take a minute, write down some bullet point ideas, the historical situation, the audience, the purpose, the point of view, source this. And I'm going to just give you a pause here because as you're writing, be a great chance for in the classroom to turn and talk and share your thinking. And then when we get to the homework's going to be different from this, but if you want to also include kind of your sourcing, you're welcome to do that, and we'll take a look at that as well. But the purpose of this is to show you this is building, right? I mean, there is disorder and there are things happening while Russia is on the front. And so the whole purpose is to really think about the revolution that's coming is growing and growing and growing. Okay. So when we get to the fall of Imperial Russia, and I'm going to talk about that cartoon on the right in a second, but let's just go through the content real quick. Russia embraced war, as all nations did, in great enthusiasm. They were certain they're going to win. They stood behind there was patriotic sentiment. We're going to stand behind our Tsar. The Duma also voted to support the war. And then the BNB, at a time when the country needed strong leadership, Nicholas II relied on the old bureaucracy and excluded the Duma, the educated middle classes, excluded the masses. And instead, if you can think about the reading we did, was that a day or two ago, about Russians' readiness for war, I think it was on Wednesday, you can see that they're not ready. September 1915, parties ranging from conservatives to moderate socialists form a progressive bloc, which called for a completely new government responsible to the Duma instead of the Tsar. So think about those minutes I just read. That was August. Here we are in September, and things are moving toward revolution. D, in response, Nicholas temporarily adjourned the Duma. Katie had mentioned how anytime he disagreed with the Duma, he dismisses them. And he does this again. And instead, what he does is he's going to travel to the front because he wants his troops to see the Tsar in the front rallying the troops. And in doing so, he leaves the government in the hands of his wife, Tsarina Alexandra. Alexandra dismisses loyal advisors, doesn't take their advice, and turns to her court favorite, which is Rasputin. So I'm sure your teachers have, if you've gotten to this unit, have talked a lot about Rasputin. He's an interesting character to talk about in history. His characteristics are just really interesting to talk about, even though his impact is not as significant as his characteristics, I think. But he is a holy man, a healer. Their son, Alexei, the Tsarevich, the heir to the throne, suffers from hemophilia. And hemophilia is a disease where any little bump or bruise leads to great bleeding, and if not caught under control, can die. But this healer, or this holy man Rasputin, seems to have a way with helping to calm this boy. And the Tsarina Alexandra entrusts him greatly because she sees him helping her son. Anyway, for political advice, she doesn't turn to her political advisors, and instead she turns to Rasputin, who dispenses terrible advice. And so 3 members of the highest aristocracy are going to plot and murder Rasputin. That story is also something of legend of how he would not die in December 1916, and they ensue. And the scandal further then weakens the Tsar and the throne and the government.
My students like the story about Rasputin.
Oh, yeah.
So in March, and it's actually March 8th, and you can see on the right, there's a picture of women workers. I'd like to point out that our Women's March that we have all over the world is on March 8th because of this event. Violence and demonstrations are going to break out. They are protesting the scarcity of food, and we're going to see that because of this, the Duma is going to elect a provisional government. And that government is going to end up sharing power with the Petrograd Soviet. And this is a council of about 2,000 to 3,000 soldiers, workers, intellectuals. And this is going to escalate over the next few days. And we're going to see this escalating as the Soviet issues an army order, number 1. And that is going to tell the soldiers in the army that they can only obey orders that don't conflict with the Soviet itself and what its goals and what they have broadcast. And so as this is escalating and the crowd and protests grow, Nicholas II is actually going to order his military to fire on the crowd. And they will disobey that order, and the military will actually join the crowd. So this is a huge moment where he's lost the support of his military. And that will lead to him stepping down. He'll abdicate in favor of his brother, who will refuse, probably rightly, the position. And so we will see then with the abdication that we have a provisional government. And the provisional government is, we're not always going to agree on everything, and it's going to come into conflict with that Petrograd Soviet as we move forward. But it's going to initially grant a lot of the things that the workers are looking for. It's going to grant freedoms of speech and assembly, freedom of religion, equity before the law, all of these liberal ideas that have swept other places. And it's going to put a lot of power into the hands of workers by granting workers significant rights here. So this is the February so-called revolution. Russia and the rest of Western Europe follow a different calendar. So that is why we talk about the February revolution on their calendar being starting in March. And that will lead to what's coming next. All right, so after this, we're going to see kind of a division. And what the provisional government, one of the big failures of this is that they're not going to understand how war weary the people are. Kerensky is going to be the prime minister of this new government. He'll become prime minister in July of 1917. And he feels that continuing in World War I is a national duty. And that is where we're going to see it's probably a very huge mistake. There's a huge loss with an offensive against the Germans that summer. And we start to see sort of a peasant revolt, peasants that are seizing land. And many of the soldiers who are peasants actually defect from the army or desert the army and go to grab their own piece of land. So during this time, we're seeing a lot of chaos. And at this moment, and this summer, we're seeing Vladimir Lenin, who's been exiled in Switzerland, return. And that's going to set the stage for the second part of this, which is the October Revolution.
So here's Vladimir Lenin. I was searching for a date, and I just could not find one. But he looks healthy and younger, kind of almost pre-revolutionary Lenin here, I think. What do we know about Vladimir Lenin? He's a law student, and he eagerly studied Marxist socialism. And as he was studying it, he began revising it, thinking about how can I apply Marxist socialism in my country, in Russia. So he believes in the possibility that revolution is determined by human leadership. This is where he diverges from Marx. So Marx always believed that it's going to be workers unite, and Marx believed that what's going to end up happening is proletariat or workers' bloody overthrow is what Marx had always predicted. And Lenin looks at this and he says, yes, I believe workers you need to unite. I believe they need leadership, though. He looks at history and he says, anytime there has been great change in history, it's been led by people, not by masses. And so he says they have leaders, and this is what we need. We need determined human leadership. And he also wants a party, a small, dedicated elite group of individuals, what he will call professional revolutionaries, to lead the march. That's also, I think it's really interesting that we keep that in mind, that he says these revolutions need great leadership for proletariats. Russian Marxists are not uniform in their beliefs. There are two groups. There are Lenin's Bolsheviks, or majority group, and then there's the opposing group, or the Mensheviks, minority group. So the Mensheviks would be different in that they believe in kind of this mass membership, a more democratic, every person vote, and the mass will move things in government. Where Lenin believes, no, we're gonna need collective ideas, and unity, but it really is going to be an elite group that is going to do the leading. So the February Revolution of 1917, which Katie just talked about, was the March Revolution. The German government provides Lenin with safe passage across Germany back into Russia. He's been in exile in Switzerland. So I always tell my students, I sure would like to have been in that room when the Germans are negotiating with him. And you kind of wonder what was talked about and promised. We're going to send you back, and here's what we want you to do. And you have to believe that part of that agreement, there's no record of it, but part of that agreement would have been, yeah, you need to end the war so that we Germans can just fight a one-front war. That's my speculation. In E, when you lead a movement, you need to brand it. You need a slogan. So Lenin's slogan was peace, land, bread. And he would add the word now as he was speaking. He was a great orator, which leaders tend to be. Peace, land, bread, now. So this appeals to everybody, right? We don't want to be at war. If I'm a peasant, I want land. I want to have food. And so this was a very popular slogan. He branded it, as you will. Next slide.
Okay, so I wanted to take a step back for a second. In the homework that we're going to give you today, we are going to talk about a secondary source interpretation. And so I've come up with quite a pretty simple one. And I want to talk about, the skill is really analyzing arguments in primary and secondary sources. This is a secondary source. And I'd like to do a couple of different skills. First of all, identifying the claim in the argument. So what is the author of the document's argument that he or she is making? And then thinking about the homework that we're going to do today. And the homework that we're going to do today is another short answer question. And it is a secondary source base. It's sort of the SAQ1 on the exam. Explain how evidence that historical evidence that you have, can support or refute an argument that we see in a source. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, not as well as Todd, I'm sure. This is Robert Service. He's a British historian, and this is from his work, A History of 20th Century Russia. And a secondary source, and one of the things that I start off the year doing, and I didn't want to take for granted that everybody who's listening has done this before, because the idea that historians don't always agree on interpretation. And that's something that students of mine sometimes take a long time to sort of wrap their heads around, is that really, really scholarly historians can disagree about things like what caused the Russian Revolution. So we start off the year with kind of dueling interpretations, but being able to read and identify an argument and then think about whether you could support it or refute it with evidence that you know is really important. All right, so under the czars, the Russian Empire faced many problems, and approval of the state's demands and purposes was largely absent from society. The technological gap was widening between Russia and the other capitalist powers. Military security posed acute problems. Administrative and education coordination remained frail. Political parties had little impact on popular opinion, and the State Duma was to a large extent ignored. Furthermore, the traditional property classes made little effort to engender a sense of civic community among the poorer members of society. While most Russians lacked a strong sense of nationhood, several non-Russian nations had a sharp sense of national resentment. The Russian Empire was a restless, unintegrated society. So as you're reading this, I want you to sort of take a minute and think, maybe even go back to that framework of GeoSprite and look at the different causations that are in here by Robert Service about why the Russian Empire at the start of the revolution is in disarray. We have technology mentioned, we have political things mentioned, we have social things mentioned. And then I'd like you to think about what information you have that you could use to either support something that Service says or to go against it. And that's what we're going to talk about when we talk about the homework, is understanding what the argument is in a secondary source, and then being able to add your own information to either a support or a refute side of the argument. So I think this is a pretty straightforward one. If you'd like to try that with your homework, we'll absolutely take a look at it. If you want to throw in something that supports something that Service says, or throw in something that refutes, we'd be happy to look at that too. Okay.
Okay, thanks, Katie. Now we need to talk about Leon Trotsky. So Trotsky is often referred to as kind of Lenin's right-hand man. And he is also deeply involved in the revolution. So we've moved, we're continuing on our revolutionary path here. Popular support for the Bolsheviks continued to increase throughout the summer into October, and they gain a fragile majority in the Petrograd Soviet. So you probably have seen that word Petrograd show up in your text, and you're like, what is this? What is that? So when World War I began, St. Petersburg was renamed Petrograd because St. Petersburg sounded too German. Berg is a German suffix of city. So what they did was they renamed the city, and Peter's city is what it is, Petrograd. So when you see that, that's what that is. B, claiming danger from Germany in the counter-revolutionary plots, Trotsky convinced the Petrograd Soviet to form a special military revolutionary committee and make him the leader. So he's now the leader of the strongest group that's burgeoning up as far as revolutionary group. And again, please know that they're still fighting the war, right? So you have group at the front and all these things going on back at home in the city. November 6, 1917, militants from Trotsky's committee joined the Bolshevik soldiers to seize government buildings and arrest members of the provisional government. So that was the government that Katie talked about, led by Kerensky. Kerensky, by the way, when this is all over, will exile to the United States, and he lives there the rest of his life, just as an FYI. The Bolsheviks declare that all power had passed to the Soviets. The Soviets are these local governing councils, and they are going to name Lenin the head of the new government. So we move from provisional government to now Bolshevik Soviet government. And so revolution is continuing, right? Change of government. D, Lenin and Trotsky succeed in bringing the Bolsheviks to power because they recognized that power was there for the taking, and they used their determined leadership to appeal to ordinary Russians who are exhausted by war, who are weary of the Tsarist autocracy, and who just want change, something radical. Next slide, please.
Okay, so Kerensky will go to the United States and Trotsky will go to Mexico.
That's true.
So change. That's definitely something we're going to talk about. Not everyone agrees on the direction that's going to take. We have up there that part A is actually right from our curriculum. So I'm going to read it because I think it sets up what we're doing. Bolshevik takeover prompts a protracted civil war between communist forces and their opponents, who were aided by foreign powers. And so we're going to talk about the two sides. And I have a couple pieces of propaganda there. On the left, we have the white propaganda. And on the right, we have the Reds, or the Bolsheviks. And I really like both of these pieces. On the left, we have the good white slaying the red dragon. And on the right, we have the Reds, the strong working man Reds, cutting the heads off the Hydra, the different heads of the countries that are in World War I. And World War I is going to be an issue because it's sort of time to get out of World War I. Lenin's going to understand that that's something that he needs to do. And he's going to narrowly win a vote to be able to do that. And he will negotiate the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Sorry, I always butcher that.
You did that well.
Thank you. This is a very, very harsh treaty for Russia, allowing them to exit World War I. In this treaty, they are forced to give up about a third of their population, about a third of their farmland, half of their industry, and 90% of their coal mines. So this is quite a harsh treaty that they negotiate, but it does allow them to exit the war. And now Lenin is able to really focus on consolidating power for his Bolsheviks, which now we're also going to call communists. And that communism is going to bring in foreign powers to try to stop the communism. The whites are going to have backing from the United States, France, Britain, and Japan, all of whom are going to try to stop the spread. And the Bolsheviks will use some tactics during this time. The first one that I want to talk about is war communism. They're really taking the land and the food from the country. They're demanding that any excess food be surrendered to the state. They're nationalizing the land. And so this, of course, is going to be really unpopular. It's going to cause people to farm only for themselves and decrease their own production. So we have a lot of unemployment during this time. We have industry really declining. And so they're also going to use the Cheka, or the secret police, and we'll see that continue moving forward in other forms. But by 1921, the Bolsheviks are successful, and the Civil War will end, and we will end up with moving forward, the Soviet Union.
So this is the formation of the U.S.S.R. With the end of these civil wars with Lenin and the Bolsheviks, or communists, now in power, by 1922, they want to establish the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, U.S.S.R. And there's a principle, or a federalism principle, in the U.S.S.R., in the government itself. So Russia is enormous, as we've talked about. But part of what they want to do is in the structuring of the government, they want to do something to answer the problem of nationalism, because they know, similar to what we saw when we were talking about Austria-Hungary, Russia, in C there you see 100 different languages spoken in the Soviet Union, 50 distinct nationalities were recognized. And so they want to create a federal structure that allows for cultural autonomy, at least in theory, in all these different places. So in theory, you have these separate areas that are not simply Russian. They could be Georgian, they could be Ukrainian, and they're going to have their own cultural autonomy. But in practice, the Russian Republic predominates over all the others. All political and economic rights are going to be limited by the one-party central government in Moscow. And then as the years passed, communists, they were the ones who were the big revolutionaries, right? The ones that wanted this huge change. But remember, though Lenin said it's going to be an elite that really lead this, and those elite in the Communist Party represent more of the privileged and satisfied as the years go on, not the put down and dissatisfied that were the revolutionaries to begin with. So take a look at this image too. This is a poster representing the 5th anniversary of the Great Proletarian Revolution by Ivan Simakov. And we have these symbols here. So we have, this strong arm holding the sickle representing the agricultural workers, the hammer representing the industrial workers, and the red star is representing the Communist Party that is overseeing or leading this charge, is the formation of that poster.
All right, Todd. So the last really content-based thing we're going to do today is to talk about Lenin's NEP, or his new economic policy. And during the Civil War, as I was saying, with war communism, the Bolsheviks had seized grain and other produce without paying the peasants. And so now we're relaxing that, and we're going to include a free market and capitalism, although both are pretty much subject to state control. Because peasants would only grow crops for themselves and excess would be seized, now they're going to start to be able to sell some of that excess. So that's going to be really important. We're even going to see that there are some that are going to profit and even become moderately wealthy. We're going to see from here a mix of private enterprises, small enterprises that are privately owned, and yet the state is going to control the large enterprises, things like banks and large industries. At the same time, Lenin is going to relax this sort of restriction where this very diverse nation had not allowed people to have their own language and customs, and they're going to relax restrictions on religion. And this is all going to be really successful because war communism was a disaster. And we're going to see that by 1926, the industrial output will surpass what it was in 1914. But that took a really long time for them to get back there because of the war and the subsequent revolutions and civil war. So the NEP is successful, and then we're going to see what happens next with that, and that'll be after the weekend. All right.
All right, our summary. So our takeaways, we wanted to explore causes and effects of Russian Revolution, and we walked you through 2 of the historical thinking skills, a lot of sourcing today. And with both of those, skill 2, skill 3, if you want to include any of that work in your homework that you're submitting, you're very welcome to do that, and we'll look at that as well. And then again, our reasoning skill that we're working on was causation.
Good. Okay, so the exam practice that we're going to do today is from last year's test. So this is a really new, relevant question, and it is the type of question that I just sort of talked about in talking about the secondary source. And we're going to look at the task scores are pretty entry level, so that's not really complicated, but you do want to kind of give a try as we go through and read the passage. So, it was the weakness of Russia's democratic culture which enabled Bolshevism to take root. The Russian people were trapped by the tyranny of their own history. For while the people could destroy the old system, they could not build a new one of their own. By 1921, if not earlier, the revolution had come full circle, and a new autocracy had been imposed on Russia, which in many ways resembled the old. All right, so this is from A People's Tragedy, The Russian Revolution, published in 1997. So this is a secondary source, a historian's look at an event from the past. And now we're looking at the prompts. So for A, you want to describe one piece of evidence that would support the author's characterization of Russia's political culture prior to the Bolshevik Revolution. For B, describe one piece of evidence that would support the author's interpretation of Russia's new autocracy in the 1920s and 30s. And C, you're going to describe one piece of evidence that would undermine the author's argument in the passage that the new autocracy in Russia resembled the old. So you're taking your content knowledge and what you know about previous and the Russian Revolution and applying it to each of these interpretations of what the author's saying. So give that a try. This is a very typical, what we call SAQ1 on the exam, and we'll talk next week about how that's going to play out on what's going to happen in May. But if you take a look, apeurovirtuallearning@gmail.com, and we'll feature some examples on Monday.
And then just this note from College Board, we know that not all students have access to the internet or a device. We're working on solutions to help students get what they need to show their best work. If you need mobile tools or connectivity or know someone who does, you can reach directly to College Board at cb.org/tech. Okay.
Hi.
Katie, I hope you have a great weekend.
Thank you. You too.
I have some advice for everybody out there.
All right.
Keep calm and scholar on.
That's
How's
awesome.
that?
That's great. That's great.
All
Okay.
right.
Listen, I have a Starbucks mug. If I had known you were going to do that, I would have brought a Starbucks mug today. Anyway, everybody have a good weekend.
All right. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.